Imagine standing in the middle of a frozen wasteland. It's minus 40 degrees. You're wearing a summer uniform. Your rifle bolt is frozen shut. But the worst part isn't the cold or the enemy soldiers rushing toward you. The worst part is looking behind you toward your own supply lines and realizing that nothing is coming. No food, no ammunition, no fuel. In June 1941, the German Wehrmacht was considered the most advanced fighting force in history. Yet, just 6 months later, they were stopped at the gates of Moscow, not solely by T-34 tanks, but by a math problem they failed to solve. We often hear about General Winter or Hitler's strategic mistakes, but historians like Martin van Creveld and David Stahel point to a much duller yet deadlier killer: logistics. So let me ask you this. If you were a commander, would you launch an invasion knowing your trucks could only reach halfway to the target? Because that is exactly what they did. Why did the German High Command ignore the warnings? And why did the most mechanized army in the world rely on over 500,000 horses? Today, we are dismantling the myth of the German war machine. Let's set the scene. It's June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa begins. 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of thousands of vehicles cross the Soviet border. It is the largest invasion in human history. The plan, drafted by Friedrich Paulus, who would later surrender at Stalingrad, was built on a single, terrifying assumption. The Soviet Union had to be defeated in 8 to 10 weeks. Why such a strict deadline? Because, as economic historian Adam Tooze explains, Germany simply did not have the fuel or resources for a long war. Here is the first crack in the armor. The German logistics planners, specifically General Georg Thomas, ran the numbers before the invasion. They calculated that supply lines would break down once the army advanced 300 miles past the border. Moscow was 600 miles away. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff, even noted in his diary early that year that the material basis for the operation was weak. They knew the math didn't work, but they attacked anyway, banking on a political collapse of the Soviet regime before the trucks ran empty. Looking at these facts, could they have done otherwise? Or was the entire invasion a suicide mission from day one? The Germans expected a blitzkrieg. The Soviets gave them a scorched earth. As the Wehrmacht pushed east, they encountered a problem that seems trivial but was actually catastrophic: the railway gauge. European rails were a standard gauge. Russian rails were wider. You couldn't just drive German trains to the front. You had to unload every single crate of ammo from a German train, carry it by hand, and load it onto a captured Russian train, if you could find one. But the retreating Soviets didn't leave trains behind. As David Stahel notes, the Soviets successfully evacuated or destroyed the vast majority of their locomotives and rolling stock. This forced the Germans to rely on trucks. But Russia didn't have paved highways like France. They had dirt tracks. The German Quartermaster General, Edward Wagner, stated in a summer report, "We are operating with a transport margin of 0. This meant that if one truck broke down, a soldier at the front didn't eat, and the trucks were breaking down. The dust on Ukrainian roads was so thick it was sucked into engines, acting like sandpaper. German engines, built for high-quality European roads, were dying after just a few thousand kilometers. So put yourself in the shoes of a logistics officer. You have no trains, your trucks are breaking, and the front line is moving away from you at 20 miles a day. How would you solve this?" By October 1941, the push on Moscow began. And then the rains came. This is the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. Historian Martin van Creveld provides a shocking statistic. In November 1941, the capacity of the rail lines supplying Army Group Center was roughly 16 trains per day. They needed 30 trains just to provide daily ammunition and food. They needed 70 trains if they wanted to build up fuel reserves for an attack. They were getting 16. The result was starvation. Not just of men, but of machines. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, wrote that the roads were so deep in mud the tanks were moving at a walking pace, and fuel consumption tripled. Imagine the scene described by soldiers of the 6th Panzer Division near Moscow. It's late October. Mud is waist deep. It freezes at night and thaws in the day. To move a single truck, they had to hitch 8 to 10 horses to it. When the horses collapsed from exhaustion, the soldiers had to push. The supplies simply stopped arriving. A report from one infantry division stated that bread rations had been cut to 200 grams, and troops were living off a land that was already empty. This was the decisive moment. The German army was still winning battles tactically, but logistically they were already dead. They were fighting a modern war with medieval supply lines. At this point, knowing you are outnumbered and out of supplies, would you have ordered a retreat to save your army, or pressed on hoping for a miracle? Now let's analyze the fatal errors, not the ones made on the battlefield, but the ones made in Berlin years prior. A common misconception is that the Wehrmacht was a fully mechanized army. This is false. In 1941, the German army used thousands of tanks, but relied on over 650,000 horses to pull artillery and supply wagons. Why is this a logistical nightmare? Because horses need to eat. A truck needs fuel only when it moves. A horse needs up to 20 pounds of fodder every single day, whether it moves or not. By the winter of 1941, the German logistics system was using trains to send hay to the front to feed the horses, instead of sending ammunition for the guns. The logistics were consuming themselves. Furthermore, there was the winter clothing scandal. It's often said that Hitler didn't send winter clothes because he was arrogant. The truth, found in the archives of the High Command, is more cynical. They had the winter coats in warehouses in Poland. But the railways were so clogged, the Quartermaster General made a calculated decision. He could prioritize trains carrying fuel and ammo, or trains carrying wool coats. He chose fuel. He gambled that the war would end before the deep freeze. He lost. As described in the diary of a German soldier named Wilhelm Proller, "We are freezing. We have to cut strips from our blankets to wrap around our feet because the jackboots conduct the cold like iron." This reveals a terrifying trade-off. If you had to choose between sending bullets to defend yourself or coats to keep warm, what would you change? The turning point wasn't a specific battle, but a specific temperature drop. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive began. The temperature dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius and below. Physics turned against the invaders. The synthetic oil and lubricants used by the Wehrmacht froze solid. You had to light a fire under a tank just to start the engine, a dangerous practice that destroyed many vehicles. The recoil fluid in artillery guns froze. You'd pull the trigger and the gun wouldn't fire, or worse, it would explode. Meanwhile, the Soviets, equipped with winterized lubricants and the wider tracks of the T-34, which navigated snow better than narrow German tracks, struck back. General Goddard Heinrici wrote to his wife, "The retreat in the snow... The equipment is abandoned. The horses fall and are left to die. It is like Napoleon's retreat, only we have no emperor to lead us home." The logistical collapse meant that when the order to retreat finally came, they couldn't even move the wounded. Thousands of frostbitten German soldiers were left behind or captured because there was no fuel to run the ambulances. The failure of logistics didn't just stop the advance. It turned a tactical defeat into a humanitarian disaster. Historians argue that the war was lost here in December 1941. Do you think success in war always depends on these dry calculations? Or is there still room for luck? Let's look at the human costs of these logistical failures. The lack of supplies forced the Wehrmacht into criminal behavior that escalated the brutality of the war. Because food wasn't coming from Germany, the High Command issued directives known as the Hunger Plan. The order was effectively, live off the land. This meant stealing the last grain and livestock from Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian peasants. A letter from a soldier named Karl reads, "We have eaten all the local potatoes. Now we take their cows. The women cry, but what can we do? It is us or them." This created a vicious cycle. By starving the local population to feed their logistics poor army, the Germans created a massive partisan movement behind their lines. These partisans then blew up the few railway tracks the Germans did have functioning. Lack of logistics led to looting, looting led to resistance, and resistance destroyed logistics. Another dilemma faced the doctors. With limited transport, triage became ruthless. One medical officer recorded that they often had to decide who to put on the last truck. A soldier with a bullet wound who might fight again, or a soldier with severe frostbite who was effectively useless to the war effort. Often, the frostbitten were left to wait and die. Where do you draw the line between duty to your survival and basic humanity? The logistics failure erased that line for many. Could it have been different? Military historian David Stahel argues that the invasion was unwinnable from a logistical standpoint, regardless of strategy. The distances were simply too vast for the technology of 1941. However, some analysts suggest a what if. What if Hitler had not diverted forces to Kiev in August 1941? Generals like Guderian argued that if they had gone straight from Moscow in August, the weather would have been fine. Guderian claimed, "We could have taken the capital before the winter." But there's a counter-argument. Even if they took Moscow, the supply lines were still broken. They would have been sitting in a frozen, destroyed city, surrounded by the Red Army, with no food, just like Napoleon in 1812. The story of Operation Barbarossa is a grim reminder that wars are won not just with courage and strategy, but with something far more fundamental: math. Thanks for watching. If you found this breakdown interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forgotten details of history. See you next time.